All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and begin this morning. We'll go ahead and begin. It's so good that you're here. I wish so bad I could have been here yesterday, but I had a wedding to perform. That couple is married, if you're wondering. I did accomplish that task. They said their vows and whatnot. It was great. Good wedding. But I'm so glad to be here today. It's good to have Brother John here with us, John Podein. Of course, many of you know him, and many of you were probably here yesterday, and if you were not, you will be treated today. I've known John for a long time. I told him it's crazy. When I was a little kid, he was at Calhoun, and I can remember looking up to him and as a good example to follow, and needless to say, he paved a good way for me to be able to follow in those good steps, him and many others. But I won't waste too much of his time, but we will have just a short prayer to begin, and then to be turned over to John. Father, we're grateful to be here. We're grateful for your great loving kindness to us each and every day and your patience with us, Father. Help us to learn to be more like you in those ways. Father, we're grateful for why we're here. We're grateful that we can study your word, and we're grateful for John as he's about to present those things to us. Thank you for his service, and give him many more years in service in your kingdom. In Jesus' holy name, amen.
I really don't know how to respond when he said he was a little kid and I was preaching. Does that mean I'm old now? You know, it's good to see the Fredericks. I've known them, man, I guess since I was a little kid in college at Faulkner, and their son Ryan and I worked together for years, and yeah, I guess we have changed a little bit, and that's what happens. And Chad, I guess you were saying yesterday, you know, last time you saw me, I didn't have this, and I like how you said Ryan, when he had it on there, he claimed it was powdered donuts. On there, and so I've struggled with it a little bit. I'll be honest, I have struggled with getting older because when you work with young people, you're supposed to be young, you're supposed to be energetic, you're supposed to look the part, right? And then you look in the mirror and it's like, whoops, what happened there? I blame this on my kids. I blame this on them, and so it's worked a little bit, especially like the gray in the hair. I put one side's Caitlin, one side's Kristen, and so, but they're growing up now, so I guess I can't blame it on them anymore. But it is good to be here. I'm assuming since this is Bible class, y'all are allowed to speak in this, right? Okay, good. Because I want to talk a little bit. We're gonna talk a lot, actually, a little bit of what we talked about yesterday about being salt and light. We'll start in Matthew chapter 5. We're gonna kind of refresh ourselves there a little bit of what Jesus said. We had a good day yesterday, a great day yesterday. With discussing some of these things and some of these topics about the whole theme is about being a servant. But being a servant means we got to do some things. We got to get our attitudes right. We got to understand what our mission is. We got to value people. And that is really where we spent a lot of day with. But one of the main points, especially of our second session yesterday, was right here at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus finishes these Beatitudes. He comes down and he says in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. And in the same way, let your light shine before others so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." And we talked yesterday about this idea of being salt and light, and that it's very easy for us to be salt and light in an environment like this. When we're inside a church building, when we're at a camp, when we're at a youth rally, when we're at a lectureship or whatever, it is easy to be salt and light in these moments because we're around people that have like-minded faith. We're around people that have the same mindset that we do of wanting to do what's right. But in reality, even when you look within Scripture, salt and light moments don't happen just on Sunday and Wednesday. Salt and light moments, in fact, the majority of the time where you have that ability to do that will happen outside the church building, will happen when you're at work, will happen when you're at school, will happen when you're at the ball field, when you're at the gas station even. There's a little place that I like to go eat sometimes in Calhoun. Little mom and pop store. In fact, Tate, your dad and I will somehow just run into each other there and usually eat breakfast in the morning when we're sitting there. But there was one moment I got a chance. There was a lady, she works there. She walked in. You could tell that she was just not something was wrong. And she was going through a hard time. She was about at the point where she was ready to give up on a lot of things. And that's the type of people that you and I run into every single day. Those are the type of people that even if they don't say it out loud, you can walk by them and you can say, "Ugh, they need a hug," or they need something. And those are the salt and light moments because they happen when we don't expect them to happen. And they happen in some ways, like we talked about yesterday, that will make us uncomfortable. That will get us out of our comfort zone. When Jesus is talking to that woman on the well, it was against culture. It was against the idea of a Jewish rabbi doing all of this. And he stayed regardless of what people thought of him. It was uncomfortable. The passage we looked in Matthew 15 with the Canaanite woman who's begging Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus is almost giving this hint off of like, no, I really don't want to do this right now. And yet he did. And it happens in that's what happens in our life. And that's why as Christians, now more than ever, and you heard me talk a lot about it yesterday, and it's just something that really means a lot to me and I'm really passionate about. Now more than ever in our time, in our culture, in our society, the church needs to be salt and light. We have elections coming up. And I don't believe in the pulpit being political by any means. But it makes a huge direction of where our country goes. And regardless of who is elected, regardless of where our country goes, regardless of what we do and what is allowed and what's not allowed, you and I are still called to be salt and light. Regardless if one day they come down, and I'm going to talk a little bit of a trip that I just returned from a couple of weeks back, where a group of us were in Scotland setting up an exposure in Scotland for next summer, actually next fall. I had to get it moved around a little bit. In a country that is secular, 2% of that country claims any form of Christianity. Over there are about 14 churches of Christ in Scotland, of a country the size of the state of Georgia. You know, we can probably count 12 to 14 congregations just in about an hour and a half drive from where we're at, right? And they talk about and see the struggle of what happens when the church is not being salt and light. And guess what? It's coming here. It may not be where we live. We are kind of in a bubble in our southeastern region where people still love God. You know, what is the big thing that you hear on the political? God, guns, and family. You know, right? You get all of those all wrapped up into one. But it's coming here. You go to other places that there is another part of the world outside of the Mississippi and the Mason-Dixon line. There are other parts here in the country. And you go outside of them, and guess what? Church is not as big as it is here. There's a challenge. And so right now in our country, probably more than ever, we need the church to stand up and be who we are supposed to be. And God needs us, and He calls us to be these type of people. Now, this is going to be a different type of a topic of class. When I originally put this class together, I struggled trying to figure out a title because it's not something that we like to talk about, but I think it's a question that we legitimately have to ask. And that question is, what happens when salt and light disappear? You know, I think back, if any of you are Marvel fans, I don't know if any of you are Marvel fans in here, you know, you had Endgame. Okay, we got one, yes. You know, at the end of it, when they dusted, not Endgame, I guess that would be the Infinity War first, when they all dusted away at the end of the movie. What happens when in our world, salt and light disappears? And what I mean by that is, what happens when we as Christians don't act the way we need to? Don't return the way, and there's a few that you can look at. Remember the first one. First one is Peter. Remember what happens in Matthew 16. Jesus comes and asks Peter, or asks the disciples, who do men say that I am? And how they answered would make all the difference in the world. And it's Peter that stands up and he says, you are the Christ. You are the Son of God. You're the Messiah that was sent. And he says, you're blessed, Peter, because of this. And because you have said this and because you made this confession, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. Now, he's not sitting here talking about, I want you to be the first pope. He's saying, you're going to be the one that's going to unlock the doors to this whole new belief system. That the Messiah has come and that the kingdom is here. And remember, who is it? Acts chapter 2. Who unlocks the doors? Peter. Skip on a few chapters when we get to Cornelius. And we call him the first Gentile Christian. Well, we could argue about that a little bit in there. He's a God-fearer, so he has a belief in God. He's not a true pagan. But in Acts chapter 10, who unlocks the door? Peter. And so he's given this king, and this is a guy that we look up to. He is a guy, yes, he sticks his foot in the mouth a lot, but he is a guy that the early church would look to because he's part of that inner circle, that those three that Jesus would always go with him, to look up to and to say, okay, Peter, what do we need to do? However, Peter didn't always live up to what he needed to do. Turn, if you would, to Galatians chapter 2. We're going to pop over here for a second. Galatians chapter 2, it was probably written somewhere in between Acts chapter 14, Acts chapter 15 in here. And so to kind of give you a time frame. So Paul is recounting a journey that he had dealing with Peter and also another character. Let's go to chapter 2, verse 1. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, kind of talking about those church leaders there in Jerusalem, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had run in vain. He's talking about his trip, that first missionary journey where he goes and sets up some of these churches and the things that are taking place. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was Greek, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they may be brought into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. So he's recounting, saying, hey, they accepted me in. I was part of who I was. When we went on this journey, they didn't make Titus, even though some wanted him to be circumcised. We weren't going to put this on him because that was not required anymore, and we had their backing. That is great. Verse 7. On the contrary, when they saw I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to be circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, there's your inner three, who seemed to be pillars, perceived grace that was given to me, they gave me the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles to be circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing we were eager to do. So Paul is saying, great, we had these people on our background. They backed us in what we were doing. We were starting, in a sense, a salt and light ministry. We were going out to the world. Don't forget the poor. We got it. Nothing wrong. Verse 11. But when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Wow. Peter forgot what it was meant to be salt and light. Here is Peter, this pillar that is reaching out to the Gentiles, if we can say it. He's reaching across the aisles, working with people that were different than him, even though he struggled with it. Remember his dream that he had before Cornelius? He goes to Cornelius, and God is putting before him all this food, and he said, you need to eat. And he said, no, God, I can't eat this food. I can't eat this. This is unclean. I've never eaten anything unclean. And he said, no, what was unclean, God has made clean. And so here is Peter, this pillar, And he's okay as long as it's just him and the Gentiles and those people in Antioch. But when his friends came up, he had to back away. Sound familiar? It's a story that I know our young people probably get played out every single day at school. It may be something that is played out at your work every single day or every single week. That as long as there are people around you that you're okay with, you're like, okay, we're good, long as these other people don't know. But when certain people come up, maybe it's some people that are going to make fun of somebody, maybe it is some people that are going to look down upon that group that you're hanging out with. There are times people will step away from one group because this other group comes. And that's what Peter does. How do you think it made the Gentile Christians feel there? It's okay, you can talk. Horrible. Second class. Made them feel like they weren't worthy of the gospel. Make them feel like they used to feel. This is why Acts 15 is going to take place. It's a huge part and a huge moment in the church because they had to make a decision. Do we force circumcision on Gentiles? Do we force them to observe our laws, our food laws, and all of these things? Because it was causing a problem. Can we make people feel like second-class citizens in the church? What happens if somebody comes and walks here? I mentioned a guy yesterday. Tate, you of course, you know the person that I'm going to talk about who owns this business. I mentioned it yesterday for the young people in here. We have there's a family at church, father, son, and some other people at church that own a business in Calhoun, William and Graham, and they had a guy call him up and because they needed people to come and work with them. And I was talking to William about this last Wednesday night, in fact, and they called him up, and he said, "Yeah, come on out here. We're out at the place where come on and let's talk to you." He pulls up and he says, "Are you Mr. Smith?" And he said, "Well, I'm William." He said, "Before you say anything else, don't judge me by what you see," because he was covered in tattoos from head to toe, including around his neck, everything else. He said there was not. And so what was interesting, Tate, you'll love this. What's interesting is Graham is the big one that said, "No, we got to hire him." Because William, he'll admit it, was saying, "I don't know if I want this person around because he has this look." He turned out to be, so far, one of the best workers they've ever hired. And so we're talking about it Wednesday night, and I was mentioning this yesterday, and I said, "You bring him, and you sit him right next to me, and if anybody says anything, I'll handle it." What was he saying? He was worried that we may treat him like a second-class citizen because of how he looks. That's exactly what Peter's doing here. He forgot he's supposed to be salt and light regardless of what the situation is. And so what we have in this section here, that's where Paul has to confront him. He says, look, you've got to be fellow Christians here. It's regardless. Yes, they come from a different cultural background. They come from a different upbringing. But you've got to do it. And it made the Gentiles feel lesser than him. And his actions led others to follow. Because look at the next person that we run into. Verse 13. The rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him. And this is the one that's really sad, isn't it? So that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Remember Barnabas, right? Acts chapter 4. This is where you first kind of get the sense of, hey, the people in the church were willing to sell things to be able to take care of things that were needed and things that were needed for the home and for the people. And so Barnabas, we have him in Acts 4, that he sells a piece of property and gives everything to the apostles that are there, and everybody's patting him on the back, right? That's where his name's Barnabas, son of encouragement, comes from. In fact, it's probably what leads, I will say it's not probably, it's what leads Ananias and Sapphira to do what they did. Ananias and Sapphira's first sin was not that they lied to the apostles. Their first issue that they had is their pride was seeing what Barnabas had, and they wanted the praise too. And it caused them to say, yeah, we sold it for all of this, because they wanted that praise back. Well, that's another side. We'll get to it. But Barnabas is a guy, and I really want you to think about who Barnabas is. We have Saul becoming Paul, as we know him, in especially after he's converted, doing what he does because of Barnabas. If it's not for Barnabas, I don't believe we have Paul. That's how big this guy is. Barnabas was a guy that the Jewish church in Jerusalem, they trusted, and they would send him out. Let's check out this story about Paul. Even when Paul was about to be tortured and killed because he's been converted, he comes back to Jerusalem, the church doesn't trust him, everything he does. It's Barnabas that says, let's get you out of there. Let's get you back home. And he leaves Paul there for about 7 years. But when it's time, who goes and gets Paul? Barnabas. Barnabas, basically wrapping his arm around Paul, tells the Christians, yeah, I know what he used to do. He has changed, trust me. And if it's not for Barnabas, we don't have Paul, in my opinion. And I want you to think about what that means. We don't have the majority of our New Testament. At least not written by him. We would have it in some other way. Paul is the main one that it's his influence of history. That's what he meant to the church. And it all because of Barnabas. But now, here we are, Barnabas, who has been salt and light to Paul, who has been this person that has looked at it. Now, he is here play acting. He's following right along with Peter. How do you really think those Gentile Christians felt then? You think you got Peter, well, here's Barnabas, who we probably like a little bit more than Peter even, and he's even acting this way. Salt and light. Folks, when we don't live to our calling that God has called us to live in a holy life, to the people around us. Yesterday, we talked about valuing people. Martin Luther said there were 5 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian. When people look at you, what do they see? What do they see about his church? The words you say, how you treat others, how you interact with others. It says a lot about how we feel about Jesus, his church, God, grace, mercy, everything. And here's Barnabas, son of encouragement, not living up to them. And so Paul has to call him out. It destroys our influence and growth potential in the church when we don't act like we should. Now, I'm not here to beat up on anybody. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to remind us that now more than ever, God needs his church and his people to be the people we need to be. Look at the 7 churches in Revelation. You have 7 churches that are there. In between Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3. There are 7 churches that there. Look at what the things that are said. When you have Ephesus, what's he tell them? You lost your first love. When he talks to Smyrna, what's he say? You're about to be tested again and suffer. Remain faithful in doing these things. He told the church at Pergama, he said, some of you hold to the teachings of Balaam and idols. He told the church in Thyatira, he said, some of you are tolerating this prophetess Jezebel. Sardis, he says, you're not awake, but you're dead, and works cannot be found in them. Philadelphia, he's encouraging them, hold fast to what you have. And of course, Laodicea, right? You're neither hot nor cold, and I'm ready to spew you out. And what was his warning? If you don't live up and be who you're supposed to be, stand up against things that you need to stand up, love people that you need to love, I'm going to take your candlestick away. Well, guess what? There's not a church in Ephesus today, at least not where it was. There's not a church in Thyatira. There's not a church in Pergama. Those went away. Now, I'm not sitting here saying, hey, Oak Hill Church of Christ here in Covington, Georgia, you need to be, I'm not here giving you that warning of, hey, you need to be careful, your candlestick's going away. But I can tell you that all of us in here probably know churches that no longer exist because they forgot to be salt and light. There's one that I'm thinking of in particular when I was a student at Faulkner in Montgomery. At one time in the 60s and 70s, this was a 350, 400 member church, strong church, big church. I preached there the day that the preacher who had been there all those years retired when I was a student. Guess what? There was like 25 in the audience. What had happened? They lost their first love. And our first love is always to people. It's always about reaching people for Christ and getting back into that mindset of the Great Commission. The Great Commission is not a mission trip, even though mission trips are good, even though mission trips are great and they're fun and they touch us in so many different ways. The Great Commission isn't a gospel meeting, even though gospel meetings are great, even though they encourage people and they strive. The Great Commission is your life every single day interacting with people. Teenagers, you interact with people that us as adults will never be able to interact with. You have influence on people that you and your parents that we will never be able to reach. But you will be able to. There are people at your work, and you know them, or your neighborhood, that you will be able to reach for Christ that other people on this other side won't be able to reach. You have influence in people. And how are we using that influence? See, if we're not salt and light, this is what happens. And I want to talk a little bit about where we're at today about some things. Statistically in the United States, this is statistics, people ask, well, let me back up. People ask, why do you still work with young people? Why do you still do what you do and everything like this? It's for statistics like I'm about to give you. Statistically, they say 70% of young people who grow up in a church, and this is, you understand I'm using this in big terms, will leave their church and leave the faith. 70% of teenagers, get that, when they become young adults, graduate from high school, go to college, will leave the church. Now that is very, very concerning, and it's very humbling. Because, and there's many different reasons, there's studies done, there's research done, and that's a whole nother class for another time or whatever, but I want to go back and really hit home with this for a second. I'm not talking about a country like India or China or even Western Europe. I'm talking about here, where we have so many tools, where we have camps, where we have retreats, where we have rallies, where we have things like Lads to Leaders, where we have different programs to help our young people that give them the tools right here. We still have 70% leaving the church. What are we missing? I truly believe it kind of goes back to this. Maybe as parents, as church leaders, as mentors, we're forgetting to be salt and light, even with our kids. One of the greatest things, I am, some people say it's not smart. I've done a lot of dumb things in life, so I just keep on going with it. I'm a part of a couple different groups online that are listed as ex-Church of Christ. I do that for a reason. Not that I'm leaving. Don't worry, we're still good. But to hear their stories and to listen to what they have to say. You want to know one of the major reasons that keeps reappearing over and over and over and over? It is either the parents or the church leaders living hypocritically. That said they practiced and preached one thing on Sunday, but their private life they lived differently. And they said, if that's what Christianity is, if that's what that's all about, I don't want a part of it. Yes?
When we had teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
we were attending a Bible church.
Mm-hmm.
We made the decision to drive miles to another church that had a Bible youth program.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted our children to be where there were youth programs. How does that fit into what you're talking about?
Well, and the truth is, let me say this. I do think that just because somebody has a youth program doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best. However, I do think that, and for me and for what I believe and what I've worked with, is I tried, at least with my girls, kind of like what you were saying, put every possible tool to help them on their spiritual walk and on their journey, to put it in their hands. That's why I still, after 25 years, still work with exposure and doing all this stuff, even when I'm ready to retire from some of these because I got gray in my beard and all this stuff. Because of that. The reality is, every young person in here, even as we have, has to make a choice for themselves. That's the sad part of the reality is. But what you hope is that you have given them enough tools and you have given them enough instruction and you've given enough chance for their faith to grow that when they're tempted and when their faith is put to the test, even if they may step out for a little while, it brings them back. It doesn't happen always. That's the sad part. I was in Oklahoma, I don't know, a couple years ago when I was doing some things for Lads to Leaders. Guy came up and asked me, he said, we've done all these things. I had my kids in church every Sunday. They got up and they were ones that were taught to lead singing and taught to speech and everything else, and they're not faithful anymore. And the reality is a program, a youth program, a retreat, whatever, doesn't guarantee faithfulness. It's still a choice. But I am a firm believer that we do as much as we can to give them the tools to say, here you go. And I do think that is part on us. I have some friends, other former friends, I guess you can say that now, that were youth ministers, and guess what? They didn't act in the best way. And it caused people to lose their faith because of their interactions inappropriately. And it hurts. It hurts the church. It hurts the body of Christ when we don't live up to salt and light. Now, understand, we're not going to be perfect. These young people aren't asking for us as adults for perfection. But they are asking for us to be real. And guess what? Hey, when we make a mistake, we admit it. Hey, I made a mistake, didn't live it. Paul stands up to Peter and Barnabas and to their face. And it's interesting here in Galatians 2, back there for a second. In Galatians 2, he stands up to Peter face to face and calls him out on his hypocrisy. If you read Acts 15, which probably takes place about a year or so after this, maybe 2 years after this incident, who's the one who stands up and quiets the crowd in Acts 15 about the Gentile churches? Peter. So in a sense, Barnabas calls him out, and Peter's like, yep, I didn't do it, and I need to live up to this. I wish we had a pill or a program that I could tell you, if you follow A, B, C, D, E, F, then this is what's going to happen. I wish I could.
God didn't make us like that.
Correct.
And I'm sure He wishes that He could have just given us a pill where we would just choose all of them.
Yep.
But having kids and having those worries, the desire
Go back to Adam and Eve. Go back to the garden. Gave them a perfect world. But he still gave them choice. Because he doesn't want you to follow him by being a robot. He doesn't want you to follow them by saying, well, I have done this. And by the way, we already had a checklist religion. It's called the old law. Paul even describes it in the book of Romans that the old law was not sin. The old law was perfect. The problem is, you and I are not. We can't live it perfect. We can't do it. But if we could check off, yes, I didn't do this, I didn't do this. The problem is, and this is what is sad, we still have that mindset of that checkbox religion. And we need to be careful at that. I'm not saying everybody. I grew up having that checkbox religion. My checkbox religion was, okay, I come to church on Sunday, I come back on Sunday night, I come on Wednesday, I take the Lord's Supper, I sing a cappella, I pray in the right. That was my religion. That was my Christianity. But God didn't call us to a religion, to a belief system of boxes and checking them off. He called us, if anybody wants to come and worship me, must come worship me in spirit and truth. Come with me from their heart. Come to me from a sense of genuineness. Come and give me who they are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter of your past. God forgives us and He puts us in this family. And because of that, we are being transformed according to Paul in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. I know we love verse 28, but 29 where he says, He's predestined us to be conformed to the image of His Son. And the things that you and I experience in our life transform us to look like Jesus. And when we look and people look at us, the question we've got to ask ourselves, do people see John or do they see Jesus? And if they see more John than they do of Jesus, I need to relook at myself and say, what can I do better? How can I truly be who God calls me to be and to live my life following after Him? I don't want to be somebody that because of my actions are no longer wanting to follow or believe in God. No, I want people, because I want to try my hardest to be salt and light in moments regardless of the situation, that when people look out, they will say, I'm closer to God. Not because of an arrogance or a pride, because that's what I want to say, but because we've got to be the people for Jesus. Probably one of the best compliments I have had recently is from an owner in Calhoun of a store. He is Pakistani. He is a Muslim. And another guy and was getting some work done on a vehicle there, and I showed up, and we got talking about different things, and I had to leave the other day early to go somewhere, and after I left, he said, the other guy said, you know, he's one of our preachers. He said, are you kidding? He said, he don't look like one. He doesn't look like a typical or act like a typical preacher. I took that as a compliment. Sorry, Tate. I took that as a compliment. Because I don't want to be pigeonholed into something that says, here's what you do. I want to be like Jesus. I don't want to be like a preacher or a minister. I want to be like Jesus to people in the world. And that's what every single one of us should strive for. Look, yes, there's people that can get up and speak and lead singing and teach and everything else like this, but the majority of our ministry work does not happen in this building. It happens outside of this building. You are ministers. You are evangelists. You are people that reach people for Christ. Every single day. When they look, when they talk to you, when they, oh, I'm running out of time, sorry. That's what happens. I get rolled and we keep going. Back up here. That's our life. And it doesn't have to be something big. It may be just that person that's next to you when you go to work tomorrow morning, that's sitting in that cubby next to you. That's had a terrible weekend. And it may not be that you'll ever know what exactly happened, but you see her, you see him, and it's just like, can we go get coffee? And it's not even saying, here, let me tell you where you're wrong. And no. Don't misunderstand me. Jesus told people the truth. But Jesus also fit their needs first. And we got people, I promise you tomorrow, whether you're at school or whether you're at work, you're going to run into somebody who needs to see salt and light in your life. I assume we end at 10:15. I went over. I apologize. I could keep talking about this for a while, so we'll talk about it in the sermon. No, I'm just kidding. All right, I guess y'all can be dismissed here.